Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. And welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week we're going to cover everything you ever wanted to know about investigations. I am delighted to have an expert in this area, Emma Hogan, with me today, who specialises in employee relations, but also very specifically in this area of investigations and training managers to be able to investigate. So we're going to do a deep dive into this because I know very little about it. But Emma, first of all, why don't you introduce yourself and explain a little bit about your background and how you came to be in this area?
Thanks, Lucinda. So my name's Emma Hogan. I own and run my own HR consultancy, EHHR Limited. And as you said, it focuses on all things ER. I actually started my career as a retail graduate, working for Boots at the time. And as part of that scheme, you did a rotation around each of the areas within a large Boots store. I did a stint in personnel, as it was called back then, and was hooked, really. I discovered that was where you got to find out everything that went on with people. And that was far more interesting to me than bottles of shampoo and conditioner. So I was fortunate enough to have a regional personnel manager at the time who was happy to switch me over. They sponsored me to do my CIPD. And I started as a generalist, really happy. I got a really good grounding. Boots were great to work for, lots of training in those days. And I had real good exposure to ER, in particular managing cases and picking up investigations. And that just continued throughout the roles that I had with other large corporates, so Environment Agency and then Rolls-Royce. And I became the go-to person in those organisations for doing the really difficult, tricky, kind of complex investigations, probably the ones that no one else wanted to do, to be perfectly honest. But I found them really interesting. And I got some really unique experiences as well in those organisations. So I picked up anti-bribery and corruption cases, financial fraud, whistleblowing, along with obviously all the usual sort of disciplinary and grievance ones. So when I made the decision to go self-employed, for me, it was, quite straightforward. It was always going to be in ER because that's what I'd specialised in. But for me, with a real onus on going and doing those really tricky, complex, maybe senior level investigations that I'd become quite well known for in the roles that I had. So that's how I've ended up where I am.
So it sounds, it's quite interesting as to how you got there, because I think lots of people would maybe shy away from these sort of subjects. So what was it you think? I mean, I guess for someone thinking they might want to specialise, was there anything particularly about your personality or what interested you think that made you good at those things or that you enjoyed about it?
I think you're right. I think people do shy away from them. And certainly, I think, interestingly, business partnering these days, I think ER gets really lost. It is much more about commercial focus and really properly partnering the business. And what I call as sort of the groundwork, the ER type stuff, getting the basics right, does sometimes get lost. For me, I think it was, I don't know, I mean, I don't want to big myself up. I think just a combination probably of really good judgment in difficult situations. And that's what I became known for, but also being able to conduct quite tricky processes. They're not nice for people to go through, with a sort of fairly hefty degree of empathy and making it as positive an experience for an employee as you can possibly make it. And again, I think that's a bit of an art form. I think sometimes in organisations, an employee does something they maybe shouldn't have done. they get suspended, they get forgotten about. People don't communicate with them in the same way. They are almost deemed guilty before they've gone through an investigation or any subsequent process. And I think for me, it's really important that they don't get forgotten about, and that communication is there, their welfare is thought about, their mental health. It's can be an extremely anxiety provoking process for people, and everyone deals with it in a different way. So probably a combination of being able to make those judgments and difficult decisions when I have to, but coupled with a degree of empathy.
That's quite a balancing act. And just one thing as well, so it's a basic from my point of view. So you talking about ER there from a point of view of the individual, and also the organisations that you're working with, I don't imagine were that heavily unionised. Quite often I've heard about ER as being in very unionised, I guess Rolls-Royce probably had more unionised environments. Is that right or wrong? Can you differentiate for me?
Yeah, totally. So you're right, Rolls-Royce were very heavily unionised. And that was part of my role in those days. So I would liaise with the unions. We would go through consultation processes if we needed to bring change in. There was a heavy dose of collective bargaining. And in the investigation space and dealing with casework, employees would bring along their trade union rep to those sort of formal meetings. So again, yes, being able to deal with like a tripartite arrangement really it is a bit of a skill in itself. But for me, I've always found unions, I don't really have an issue with them. I know a lot of people do. I kind of think you get some really good trade union reps. You've just got to learn to work with them. The relationship is never going to be completely harmonious. It's not designed to be, in my view. But they can be really helpful to you in a situation such as an investigation, because you can have conversations with them that will help the employee going through that difficult process to feel a bit more reassured and a bit at ease. So for me, I view, the union element as positive rather than a negative.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Okay, great. So before we perhaps go into the masterclass where I get to ask you really basic questions, and then is there any particular reason right now why, investigations have been going on forever, right? Is there any reason why it's more important or companies need to pay more attention to this right now?
I think there's probably two or three. I think firstly, in general, investigations have been in the news in the past couple of years far more than they have been before. We've seen some fairly horrendous examples of where investigations haven't been done properly. Post Office would be a classic example. And where they've been flawed, and then the ensuing processes and the consequences are therefore flawed. So I think in general, it's much more high profile. I guess two slightly more specifics. On Saturday, new legislation came into play with a new preventative duty to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. Now, there's always been, the need to prevent harassment in general, but this new duty is specifically around sexual harassment and requires an employer to take reasonable steps to prevent it from happening in the first place. And there's a number of different risk areas there for organisations to make sure that they comply with that new duty. And one of them would be making sure that they promptly, robustly, thoroughly, consistently investigate any allegations of harassment, but particularly sexual harassment. And obviously to do that, they need to make sure they have people trained, skilled people trained in the skills of investigating to make sure that that process happens properly. And then the final one will be the potential employment rights bill that the new government have proposed that's currently being consulted on. And there are lots of different things in there, but one key one is the proposal to allow a day one right for a claim for unfair dismissal. What that will do is obviously allow individuals who couldn't previously take a claim until they'd earned their 2 years service. It will allow them to take a claim from day one should they feel they have grounds to do so. That therefore is likely to increase the number of issues that employees raise, and therefore the number of investigations that go along with it. So now I think is a really good time for us to be talking about making sure and organisations are equipped to conduct investigations effectively.
And it's interesting, actually, when you say organisations, when it's that far reaching in terms of the things you just talked about, it may be more than HR, I imagine, that needs to know about how to do this, or in the first stage, and perhaps we can cover that.
Absolutely. And traditionally, organisations will ask line managers to investigate. That's the way that most investigation disciplinary grievance policies are written. And there are real merits to doing that, but there are some real failings with that at the same time, because generally, and I am generalising, line managers aren't equipped to conduct an investigation. More often than not, they're asked to do it alongside their day job, which inevitably means it doesn't get the time and attention it perhaps deserves. It takes longer than it should. They're not focused on it. It's the first time they've done one, maybe in 2, 3, 4 years. So again, for them, it's like going back to the beginning again. I think I've worked in some organisations, so Royal Mail being one of them, where they actually had teams of HR individuals who were trained to do particular types of investigation. So harassment ones, discrimination, the trickier ones, I guess. And that works really well because they're doing it day in, day out. And because of that, they're really skilled. They know what they're doing. They get done really quickly. The lessons are learned. The feedback goes straight back into the organisation. So, you can do it either way. I think if you're going to ask your line managers to conduct investigations, you've really got to make sure that you're providing them with some robust training regularly, not just as a one-off either.
And almost like a process. They need to know, I mean, I'd like to think that I could work out what to do from a common sense point of view, but I'd far rather be told the right way to do it, because the consequences are significant for the organisation if it's not done properly, right? So, there's no real excuse, I guess, in the eyes of the regulator, if you haven't, if you asked a manager to carry it out and they were biased or did a half-hearted job, that's not going to be good for you as an organisation. So, okay, so I can see the importance of it, and particularly with the new legislation coming in, which you talked about. That was the 26th of October for those people listening later, as to when that came in, 2024. So let me go basic then. So we're in an organisation, large or small. What would trigger the need for an investigation?
So it could be a number of things, but again, to keep things simple, essentially it would be either an employee has potentially done something they shouldn't have done that falls then within the disciplinary policy that requires an investigation into their conduct at work, or it would be an employee has raised an issue, normally known as a grievance, or a claim such as a harassment claim. So the employee has a problem and raises it in the workplace, and that then needs to be investigated to establish whether the employee's got grounds to raise that complaint. So generally it's either raised by the organisation if an employee's done something wrong, or raised by an employee if they believe that the organisation or another employee has done something they shouldn't.
So I can see how the second one, that would come to HR naturally, right? So someone's complained that they're invoking the internal processes, they've reported it or complained in some way, raised a grievance, I guess, or something. The first one, I'm interested, how does that overlap with normal performance management? I guess where a manager should perhaps talk to somebody about how they behaved, or otherwise. Is it there's a question mark as to whether it's reality or not? Where does it, how do those fit together?
So performance management for me is very much about the day-to-day, how you go about doing your job. And you're absolutely right. There will be occasions where somebody maybe has been rude to a customer, or somebody internally not performed as they should, and the line manager will pull them across, have a word, and you would hope that, nip it in the bud, and you would hope that it's done and dusted. With formal investigations and a formal process, you're talking more about when an employee has really dropped below the standards that's required. And a lot of organisations now will have something called a code of conduct, which sets out very clearly what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in the workplace. And so it will be more than just being rude to somebody. It could be, persistently being rude to somebody, but more likely than not, what would trigger a formal investigation would be something in the realms of, depending on the work environment, stealing, some kind of harassment, discrimination, racial abuse, that kind of thing. So it tends to be at a different level from what we would class as performance management, where you would believe, based on what you know, that it's likely to warrant some form of formal action. Whereas performance management, yes, may turn into a formal process, but it is more about the day job It's more about actually, are they doing the job that we've employed them to do, as opposed to something's gone wrong and we need to investigate to find out exactly what's happened.
Yeah, okay. And I think certainly is, and it's a breaching legislation. Or on that code of conduct thing, would you recommend that companies have a code of conduct? I mean, if they haven't got that sort of thing, are there templates out there that people can access and stuff for that?
Yeah, there's a lot of examples. A lot of organisations publish their codes of conduct. Actually, they're not difficult to get hold of. And I would recommend that an organisation has it. It doesn't have to be War and Peace. It's a really good thing to have, though, that you can then point back to say to an employee, you know, that was in breach of your code of conduct. And the code of conduct would lay out standards of behaviour, what's expected. It would cover things like bribery and corruption, if that's relevant in a particular organisation, and it would be really clear for employees about how to report an issue if they have an issue at work. So very much two-way. This is what we expect of you. This is what you can expect from us if you raise an issue.
Yeah. Okay, great. So one of those two occurrences has taken place. This is a scenario: something's been identified as an issue, or something's been reported. So who and how should the investigation be carried out? Who should do it ideally, and what are the steps?
So who, I guess, goes back to our earlier conversation, depends really on the stance that your organisation have taken. So it could be someone from HR. It's more likely to be somebody from within the management line. And again, different organisations will have different rules around whether it needs to be somebody one level above the person who's had allegations made against them, or whether it can be anybody. So yeah, I would expect in most cases it's going to be a line manager who would carry that out. And there would be a process in place, we would hope, in an organisation, that the manager would be supported by HR in terms of what to do, the steps to go through. Again, that varies. You know, some organisations have case management systems in place that guide a manager through, provide template paperwork for them to complete on a system. Others will be much more paper driven, and it will be down to HR to really guide the line manager through the various steps of an investigation. But it would start with the employee being invited to attend an investigation meeting, and that would be their opportunity to give their version of events.
Okay, so you start by talking to them. They wouldn't go on in the background, sort of without them knowing. If that's something, actually, if it was bribe, if you thought someone had been stealing or something, would you invite them straight to the meeting, or would you need to go and look for more evidence outside the?
You might do. I would always advocate the more transparent you are with an employee, the better. I just think it gets the investigation off to a better start. I think having that transparent and open and honest conversation, sometimes you can't, you're quite right. It does depend on the nature of what's being alleged as to whether or not you really need to go and do some background checking. And an example of that would be if you thought somebody had been abusing the internet whilst at work, you would want to be able to have some evidence on which to base that allegation, and not necessarily just take someone's word for it. So very much depends on the allegation that's been made.
Before they can go off and delete it. That's why you have these things in policies which say that the company can check your internet activity they want to. Okay, so yeah, that makes sense. But ideally you would have an open, there's a whole thing about collaborating or cooperating with the person, again, almost innocent till proven guilty, give them a chance to be heard. Would they bring someone like, because is it like a disciplinary process, I suppose, in that you invite them the opportunity, you have to give them a certain amount of warning, do you, and invite them to bring someone with them? Is there anything there?
You don't need to for investigations. There's no sort of legislation around that. There is no right to be represented or bring someone with you, have a companion at an investigation meeting. Again, a lot of organisations allow it. And again, I'm in the camp of, you know, if you start saying no to things, then you're unlikely to have as cooperative an individual coming along. But there may be circumstances where, you know, it's just not possible to allow that. And that's perfectly fine. As I say, there is no actual right to do that. When you get into a disciplinary process, there absolutely is a right for that individual. So you would have to do it at that point.
So would you be emphasising that this is preliminary at the moment? This is purely an investigation in terms of how you position it, and would you invite them, I guess, in writing? How is it formal in terms of inviting people to do something face to face, or Any other sort of best practice that you'd recommend?
So when I undertake investigations, again, it's sometimes down to the client to decide, and and I will say, look, we should just do it the way you normally do it. So, but because I'm external and maybe not just down the road, I do a lot of my work now over Teams. So I do conduct investigation meetings over Teams. Yes, we would advocate that you write formally and invite somebody, making sure you lay out the rights that they do have in those circumstances, and giving them as much information as you can in those circumstances. You would also put things in that letter, such as, if they want some support, maybe from an employee assistance program that the organisation have to support them through a difficult time, make sure that's included as well. So fairly standard letters exist to be able to do that. ACAS are a really good source of information for template documents if people haven't got their own in an organisation, and they cover all the key points that you would need to do. But yes, invite formally in writing. You can meet face to face, you can meet over Teams. That is acceptable now. It probably was frowned on at one point in time, but COVID has changed all that. So and yes, you would use that as your chance to establish the facts. That's what an investigation's about at the end of the day, is establishing what exactly happened in the particular situation. And the role of an investigator is to speak to the individual who has been alleged of doing something wrong, but also to identify anybody else they should be talking to. So any witnesses to an event, anybody the individual themselves can put forward to say, actually, they'll give you an account of what did or didn't happen. And then to your earlier point, any other information you might need to go and collate, be that CCTV footage, if that's something that's relevant, emails, WhatsApp, chat messages, lots of different things that as an investigator you would consider the issue at hand, and then make a decision about what other information you need before you can come to a decision.
So you really need to gather stuff in the round, and you need to be as objective as possible. And yeah, of course, you would get other people, and presumably, actually, which is actually easier now if you are doing on Teams or something, is you can get a transcription quickly and easily, relatively, but you would have had note takers, I assume, because you've got to have documents of what's been discussed and what people have said.
Yeah, so I take my own notes most of the time. I'm old school. I still scribble down in my own shorthand, and then I dictate mine actually into Word. I've used transcription before, not a huge fan. It records every people who talk over each other. It sometimes just misses out that conversation. So they come with a health warning for me, transcriptions. They can be really useful for some things, useful as a check. But actually you spend as much time updating and getting the transcription to make sense as you would if you just did it yourself in the first place, is my view. There is some technology out there.
Was it acceptable to use the recording?
It has been done, yes. It is more acceptable now, I understand, certainly from a tribunal perspective, than it used to be. Again, I think things have changed in that regard. So it can be submitted. And the beauty of that is there is no debate about whether that's the accurate notes of the conversation, because it's there, it's there live. So it does remove any sort of debate about whether the notes are as accurate as they can be.
It's become less taboo, really, hasn't it? Almost normal to be, because we're doing it all the time. In a very short period of time, that's happened. Okay, yes. So I've got a feel for that. So you've carried it out, and then is there a kind of evaluation stage where you make a decision, or would you run that past other people, or how's it drawn to a conclusion?
So I would always recommend that you have an investigation plan that you start with, that details all the information we've just talked through, who the witnesses are, your timescales, who you want to talk to, and then an investigation evidence summary that as you're going through your investigation, you can log key bits of evidence that your witnesses give you against the allegations that you have that have been raised against the individual. And that really sort of helps you to start to see which bits are being challenged, which bits everyone agrees on. And that can then help you do exactly that, the evaluation piece. So weighing up the evidence that you've got, and coming to your decision about what you believe the facts to be. And it won't always be clear cut. sometimes it is he said, she said, and there is no other evidence, there's no witness who can prove or disprove that. And in those circumstances, it's your job as an investigator to come to what you believe has happened based on the balance of probabilities. So it's not beyond all reasonable doubt. It is looking at, based on the evidence that I've got, this is what I believe has happened in this set of circumstances.
So you have to make a decision. You wouldn't ever have, because that's really, so that's, if it's a he said, she said, and a sexual harassment, and and you've had mixed reports from everybody else, do you have, that's a tricky one, isn't it, as to where you have to land?
Yeah, it is really difficult. And you would hope that there is something in all the evidence that you've collated that will tip you one way or the other. It might just be the credibility of the he or the she in those circumstances. It could be as small as that. It could be a witness statement that is more reliable than another witness statement that where they don't corroborate. So it is difficult. There are times, I've not done it very often, but there have been a couple of times where I have had to say, I simply can't make a finding on a particular point because I just have nothing to go on.
Okay.
But 9 times out of 10, you need to be able to tip one way or the other. And as I say, because it's not beyond all reasonable doubt, it is a judgment call at the end of the day, that based on what I've heard, seen, been told, pulled together in my investigation, on this occasion, I believe it's more likely that it was A or B.
And so would that maybe mean that the consequence is less severe? So if you found resounding evidence this person had been sexually harassing others or whatever it would be, then you could jump straight to, because presumably that you then hit the disciplinary process, you could jump straight to final written warning or dismissal even. Whereas if it was very light evidence, you might give them a written warning or whatever the language is, for a lower stage thing. Is that how you'd handle it if the evidence is weaker?
Potentially, yes, because you haven't got as much to go on, and so you can't then with confidence say in your investigation report, that all I would do as an investigator is say whether or not I believe it warrants disciplinary action. So it's not for me to decide as an investigator what level of action they get. That would be passed with my report to a disciplinary manager, who would then review everything again in the round and make a decision, taking into account any mitigation the employee puts forward, what they feel is the right level of sanction. So as an investigator, that's why it's so important that you, to the best of your ability, land in terms of what you believe has happened and what you believe the facts of that particular case are, so that then if it goes forward to disciplinary, the disciplinary manager has got some good evidence and a good
information to make a fair decision. Okay, absolutely. Cool. All right, so that makes sense as a process, not without its challenges. And I suppose, are there any obvious pitfalls that people or things that traps that people fall into, or learning points that you'd share with people having to do this?
I think, some of them we've talked about, which is really making sure you're asking the right people to do the investigation in the first place. And I think that's probably the biggest
Having
pitfall.
A plan sounds like a good idea, because then you can prove you've been objective as well, having that plan.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can show the process you've gone through, and it's a really good backup if there are any challenges further down the line. So absolutely have a plan. And I think the other one would just be around communication, and that I talked about it a bit before, that sort of bizarrely positive employee experience, but bearing in mind there's an employee at the end of this process, and being fair, communicating with them, doing what you say you're going to do. So don't say you'll be in touch in a week and then leave them hanging for 3 weeks, because whilst you might be super busy doing your investigation, that employee could be suspended, could be sitting at home really fretting and worrying about why you've not been in touch. So that communication piece right the way through is really vital.
Yeah, and actually doing it in a timely fashion, I think, is quite important, in terms of if someone's suspended and wondering what's going on and it's taking forever. That's awful for people, I imagine, as well.
Totally. And again, sadly, in my experience, it's something that organisations get wrong very, very often, for a number of reasons. And, it is out of sight, out of mind, I guess, for a lot of people. But it is having somebody, maybe the employee's line manager, who's tasked with keeping in touch with them on a weekly basis, doing that welfare check, making sure they've got the support they need, answering any questions. If they can't answer questions, pass them to the investigating manager, making sure that there's a support mechanism for that employee is hugely important.
And I suppose it also ties into the point we sort of started with, which actually, I don't know, I think I glossed over slightly in terms of who should do it. So you presumably don't want the line manager to do the investigation necessarily, because they should be supporting the individual maybe, but you might want someone outside of the line, because presumably the line manager might have to oversee you've got to think about the next levels of the
absolutely.
And in a small organization, that's quite hard too. So I suppose there's something here about when is it best, when should you consider seeking external help, training other managers up so that they could listen. If you're a large organization, that's slightly easier. That's an interesting angle maybe as to who does it, leaving yourself with options later.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, different sized organizations have different challenges with that. And some organizations will have the line manager doing the investigation. That's absolutely fine. I think my point is you then need to make sure that somebody else is picking up that welfare piece, because to ask the line manager to do their day job and the investigate, it starts to become quite a lot. And the bit that always
that feels like two hats, doesn't it? It feels you'd feel insincere. That's not what you want people to do.
No, exactly. And yes, there is the option of external people like myself to come in and do an investigation, and I get asked by lots of different size clients. So it's not just the smaller ones who maybe haven't got the HR team or haven't got the expertise themselves. That does happen, but larger organizations, sometimes when it's an issue within the HR team, we'll ask for somebody external to come and support, or when they've got somebody particularly senior in the organisation and it starts to become quite sensitive, then they will ask for an external investigator to come in. And again, there's no issue with doing that unless you've got somewhere in your policy that you're not going to allow external individuals to investigate. I think it's just weighing up as an organisation, when is the right circumstance to do that. Obviously there's an added cost to it as well, which for some organisations will be a really crucial factor.
Although the cost of not doing it, I suppose, in some of these probably have unlimited payouts, so it's also maybe it's how high is the risk in terms of not doing it properly, and so that's also worth thinking about. And then I suppose so external is a good idea some of the time, and it's horses for courses in that circumstance. And then the other side is, I'm just thinking management training courses is teach people how to set objectives, coaching skills, performance management, but I've never thought of investigation. So would you think that that's something, you offered management training, don't you? So who's that best targeted at? All managers or just certain managers? And what sort of stuff would you cover? How long does it take to train someone up in it? Because how big of an investment it is of time and money, of course.
Yeah, so the investigation training that I've developed with a consultant colleague of mine, Jane Kim, that is, we run it two different ways. So we can run it face-to-face over 2 days, which obviously allows the opportunity to be a bit more interactive, a bit more discussion, a few more activities, and a bit more on sort of in the moment coaching. Or we do a Teams version, which is 2 4-hour modules, which we can split across 2 different days, 2 weeks. That's for the client to decide when they want to do it, which allows a bit more flexibility in terms of pulling managers away from day jobs, etc. And we do that for HR and we do that for managers as well. So we will train either. It just depends, as I say, on the model of operation, the HR model that the organisation has. And we cover, the basics of a bit of law. We don't go too heavy on the law, right through to exactly what we've talked through today. Where do I start? How do I pull a plan together? How do I collate my evidence? What questions should I ask? We cover some bits around questioning skills. We make it as interactive as we can to test their understanding, with a few sort of quizzes and things along the way. We have a case study that runs all the way through it, which without giving anything away, starts looking like one thing and ends up looking like something quite different. So that's a really good learning experience for people. So it's you know, what's great about it for me, you know, if someone said, well, why is your training any better than, you know, anywhere else? Jane and I still do the job. We are actively investigating. So our experience is really current. It's really fresh. Sometimes we run a training course and we're in the middle of doing an investigation ourselves. So we can really, really relate to the concerns and the issues that people are raising with us.
You're expert. Yeah, so what you're saying is like the training, you're delivering the training. So part of the unspoken aspect of the course is access to your skills and knowledge. And so I imagine every course is slightly different because people ask different questions. Well, and what we'll definitely, well, it's probably time to wrap up anyway, but we'll put links to your training and your website and stuff, because I can definitely see how that would make sense. I mean, if I was in a large organization, you're not going to train every single manager, but if you had a pool of, a bit like you might have a pool of coaches, you might have a pool of people who can do investigations, then that would be a good idea. Absolutely. And I suppose training people up in a smaller organization. In a smaller organization, do you do open courses, or do you tend to in-house courses? Because I guess in a smaller organization, it might be easier to get an external person to come in if it's a very occasional situation, or people can listen to this and maybe shadow someone or something.
Absolutely. So to date, we've tended to do in-house courses for clients, but it is something we're looking at. We just need to invest in a better booking system. That's the thing that you really need if you're going to do it.
It's logistics. It's always logistics getting it. Well, I guess if people go to your website, which I'll give you an opportunity to plug now, however, then if and when you run them, people can register for those. Otherwise, it's in-house. But certainly, I mean, I think you've shared a load of really useful information on this podcast. I hope that hopefully that's also going to be valuable to people. So thank you so much for joining me today, Emma. Do you want to just explain how people can get in touch with you? You're obviously on LinkedIn, and just share your website, and we'll put it all in the show notes as well.
No problem. So yes, I am on LinkedIn, just under Emma Hogan. You can get in touch with me at my website's www.ehhr.co.uk, and if you want to send me a message, it's just emma@ehhr.co.uk. The new training company that Jane and I are setting up, we're in the process of sorting branding, which is another headache, but we'll get there, and then that'll be up on the website really soon as well. So if anyone wants just to have a conversation or ask any more questions, more than happy to have a chat.
I definitely can see why people would want to reach out. Emma, thank you so much for joining me today on the HR Uprising podcast.
Thanks, Lucinda.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.